Please, viewers who are not in conversation, please mute your audio and video. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shraddha Tanga from Gulbarga, your moderator for this two-part webinar. Thank you so much for joining us for this exclusive law series webinar on the topic Preamble of the Constitution. We are extremely grateful to Swami Nirbhayananda Saraswati, Dr. M.R. Venkatesh Sir, and to all the members of Expresia who have tuned in and made this event possible. Now, over to the introduction of today's opening speakers. Swami Nirbhayananda Saraswati is the president of Ramakrishna Vivekananda Ashram, Gadag and Bijapur. Very early in his life, he came under the influence of the inspiring life, work, and philosophy of Swami Vivekananda. His life's work reflected his passion in bringing the teachings of Swami Vivekananda into actual working reality. Swamiji is a force and an inspiration behind Ramakrishna Vivekananda movement in northern Karnataka and runs Vivekananda Seva Kendra, school for unprivileged, founded in 1984 at Marangoli of Bijapur district, known for its academic excellence. This institution has been a shelter for students, children of Kargil who are given free education till 10th standard in this residential school. He is the recipient of the Ambassador for Peace conferred by the United Peace Federation, a consultative body of economics and social council which works in support as of United Nations. Being a powerful speaker, he has influenced address youths, teachers, professors, and professionals. Swamiji has extensively traveled and lectured at universities of Stanford, Colorado, Dartmouth, etc., in addition to giving public talks at cities like Washington, D.C., Portland, Dallas, Seattle, Boston, San Diego, etc., of United States, Paris and Vienna of Europe, with Geneva and Turin of Italy joining the list. In addition to this, Swamiji has the distinction of being a speaker at the Fourth Parliament of World Religions at Barcelona, Spain in 2014. Swamiji was an invited speaker at the Akka Sammelana of Chicago and chaired the youth session at the International Vedic Conference held at Orlando of USA in the year 2008. It is a great privilege and honor to us that His Holiness has graced this occasion. Swamiji, the mic is yours.
ಮುಗಿತಾ?
Hari, Mukitu.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Om Sthapakaaya Dharmasya Sarvadharma Swarupine Avatara Varisthaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. Pavitram Charitam Yasyaha Pavitram Jivanam Tatha Pavitrata Swarupinyai Tasyai Kurmo Namo Namaha. Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukhaswarupaya Swamine Tapaharine Mokam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yatkrupa Tamaham Vande Paramananda Madhavam Vireshwarananda Dayamrutabdhim Sri Ranganathancha Vijnana Bhanum Chidananda Rupa Sri Purushottamariam Dhyayan Hrudisthan Krutinam Hyavaimi. Friends, it's a matter of great pleasure. Today I have been invited by KLE Law College to say a few words in the form of a keynote address or inaugural address or whatever it is about the legal system in ancient India. It's really a very relevant subject. Every person that wants to unfold himself develop himself into a responsible citizen, he is supposed to be having the fullest knowledge of how the country to which he belongs has trodden its way since times of its being brought into existence. India has got a great history. It has set wonderful precedents in almost every field of human concern, every field of human relevance, be it science, be it technology, be it philosophy, be it mathematics, be it literature, be it even jurisprudence. India has set a marvelous example. In fact, when the British came here, especially in the times of Warren Hastings, a serious effort was made to frame laws that would be suitable and relevant to the sort of the system in which people were living here at that time. If I remember well, it was Wilkins and so many others, William Jones and so many others that did a lot of good work in this direction. In fact, India has all along been emphatic about the duties of a man. The first convocation address that is recorded in human history appears in Taittiriya Upanishad. Acharyopasanam. The title of that convocation address is Acharyopasanam. It starts with a very significant sentence. Vedam Anucha Acharyaha Ante Vasinam Anushasti. On the lines of Vedic principles, I, an Acharya invited for giving this convocation address, would like to enlighten you upon certain disciplines, Anushasanam, certain disciplines. Mark that word discipline. Just now, the students have completed their university education. They have become Snatakas. They are entering into public life. Before they enter into public life, they have to charge themselves with a tremendous spirit of responsibility. India is a land which has always equated freedom to responsibility. Freedom means responsibility. Freedom and responsibility, they are now two different things. Vivekananda emphasizes this in one of the talks he has delivered in Madras, that famous Madras speeches of Swami Vivekananda. Freedom means responsibility. The man that is not responsible, that doesn't have that sense of responsibility, should never claim for any freedom. Even if he claims, freedom must not be given to him. More responsible you are, more freedom you can enjoy. If you want to have freedom, do not aim at freedom itself. What you must aim at is that sense of responsibility. How much responsible you are for your own personal discipline. How much of discipline you can ensure on behalf of the people around. How many people you can take the responsibility of ensuring the sense of responsibility of. The father is highly respected in the family. It is because he is responsible for the good conduct of about 4 or 5 people, his wife, his children, and all that. Not only he is responsible for his personal dignity, personal behavioral perfection, he is also responsible for the behavioral perfection of all the members of the family, and therefore he becomes the recipient of the highest freedom, highest respect. Respect and freedom is always in direct proportion with the sense of responsibility that a man has bestowed upon himself. This is India's spirit of jurisprudence. So, what is freedom? As I said, freedom is another form of responsibility. And duty, responsibility is today's duty. What you call in today's constitution, today's jurisprudence as duty, ancient times India has indicated that sense by using the term responsibility, dharma, dharma, dharma. This is one word that has been, I should say, A lot emphasized all through Indian scriptures. Najatu kamat, na bhayat, na lobhat, dharmam tyajet, jivitasya hetoho. Out of fear, you are not supposed to give up your dharma. Dharma means here, please mind, righteousness, the right conduct, the ethical code, that tremendous, what I should say, adherence, strict adherence to the principles in life. And how is dharma defined in Mahabharata? Atmavat, Atmavat, Paresham na samachare, Atmavat pratikulani, Atmavat pratikulani, Paresham na samachare. Iti dharma. Dharma means what is inconvenient to you, what is uncomfortable to you, what is troubling to you, you should never met out to others. You should never subject others to what is inconvenient to yourself. What you don't like to happen in your own life, you should never be a cause for that to happen in the life of others. That is how it can be summed up. So that means to say, you have to see your own self in others. You are seeing your own self in others. When you are troubling others, you are troubling your own self. Atmavat sarvabhutani vikshante dharma buddhayaha. At other place, Indian scripture emphasizes upon this. Atmavat, Atmavan, everywhere. You have to see your own Atma, your own self. So this is how the sense of responsibility is very much emphasized. Go through the four Vedas. Glance through the four Vedas. You will never come across the term what you call as right. The term right is never referred to in all the four Vedas. In the four Vedas, in all 11 Upanishads, principal Upanishads I mean, in all 18 Puranas, in two Itihasas, Ramayana and Mahabharata, nowhere you see any reference to the term right, human right. Not a single reference has ever been made, but unnumbered references have been made to the duty, responsibility, the dharma. This was one of the essential features of India's jurisprudence. What does it mean? It only means to say a person responsible, a person that is recipient of his sense of responsibility, the person who is fully responsible in all his dealings, in all his endeavors, automatically will have all the freedom that he wants. Freedom is an attainment. Freedom is a consequence. Freedom is not birthright. Freedom is not natural. According to ancient India, freedom is not taken for granted. It is not spontaneous. It is not natural. Only those who are responsible will have freedom. Others will not have freedom. Your degree of freedom is in directly proportional to the degree of sense of responsibility that you have shown in all your dealings so far in your life. That is how human right and human duty was defined in India. And remember, always we will be very much eager to have rights. Even in recent times, Vivekananda, very much as though he was echoing the sentiment of ancient India. In one of the occasions that he has spoken, he has addressed the Indians, he says, nothing in this world can prevent you from getting what you deserve. Here, indirectly, again he emphasizes upon the sense of responsibility. Several codes came into existence in ancient India. The most notable of which was Manusmriti. We all have heard of Manusmriti. Smriti itself is a sort of constitution, a code, ethical code. Not only Manusmriti, several other Smritis also came into existence. Parashara Smriti, Yajnavalkya Smriti, and whatnot. Smriti is different from Shruti. Smriti does not belong to Veda. Veda always contains eternal laws, while Smriti, a constitution, an ethical code, will never be eternal. It is changeable, it is dynamic. Not only it is changeable from time to time, within the case of a single individual, it is changeable from one stage of life to another. What laws are applicable for student life are not applicable for the householder's life. This is India's ancient jurisprudence. What is applicable during student days, the set of laws applicable during student life is not applicable when he is a householder. What is applicable for householder is not applicable for the vanaprastha. What is applicable for gruhastha or brahmacharya or vanaprastha is not at all applicable for sannyas. Sannyasi, no law is applicable for him because he rejects society and he enters into forest, or he frees himself from all social ties. He is sannyasi, is the ideal Indian society. You must go beyond all laws. That is how India has emphasized. You have to go beyond all laws. A person must try to go beyond all laws. Mahatma Gandhi need not be bound by any laws. A Bhagavan Buddha need not be bound by any law. A Rama need not be bound by any law because they were so much matured, they were so much dignified, so natural. Their righteousness was a natural trait in them. It was not necessary for them to be bound by any sort of laws. So every person should try to go beyond the framework of the law. A sannyasi is supposed to be like that. A sannyasi, he will never live for himself. Selflessness will be something that he breathes. He is supposed to breathe selflessness. For a man who is absolutely selfless, it is not necessary for you to bind him or tie him with any moral code. That is how India prescribed the moral code or the set of laws, the set of laws. Not only it varies from ashrama to ashrama, brahmacharya ashrama to grihastha ashrama to vanaprastha to sannyasa. Even the code of conduct, the code of law varied from varna to varna. What is applicable for a brahmana was not applicable to kshatriya. What was applicable to kshatriya was not applicable to vaishya, and what was applicable to vaishya was not applicable to shudra. In Mahabharata, we come across a very interesting situation. Yudhishthira was tested by Bhishmacharya about his knowledge in the contemporary moral code, contemporary Indian legal constitution, you can say. Now, Yudhishthira was tested. Even Duryodhana also was tested. Same crime was committed by all the four Varna people, a Shudra, a Vaishya, a Kshatriya, and Brahmana. All the four have committed the same crime, and they have been produced before the king, Dhritarashtra. Yudhishthira was questioned by Bhishma as to what punishment should be given to these all four culprits who have committed the same mistake. Duryodhana says, all the four must be given the same treatment. No discrimination should be made. Yudhishthira says, no, there has to be discrimination in the sort of the punishment that these people are liable to be subjected to. A Shudra must be given least punishment because he is not so much educated. He is not so much bound. He has got his own limitation. His mindset, his mental ability, his ethical code, his moral fiber is such that he cannot, even though he wants, he cannot bring himself strictly into any moral code. That is his natural inability. And therefore, a little bit of sense of pardoning him should prevail while dealing with him. Shudra should be given the least punishment. Vaishya should be given a bit more punishment because morally he is a bit more elevated. Kshatriya should be given little more punishment, and Brahmana should be given the highest punishment. He is supposed to be the ideal for the society. He himself, remember, Varna was something voluntary. Varna was flexible. There was free movement from one Varna to another Varna. And Varna was decided based on the combined effect of the education he got and also his previous samskaras. By birth, everyone was Shudra. Manu himself clears this point. There is no any confusion here. Janmana jayate Shudraha. By birth, everyone is Shudra. Be he born, he may be born in a Brahmana family or Kshatriya family, irrespective of the family into which he is born, he is a Shudra only. Janmana jayate Shudra. They are all put to schooling. During the school days, that is from the age of 8 up to the age of 25, in those 17 years of period, they all will show their instincts, their voluntary readiness to bind themselves into strict moral codes and all that. Depending upon their ability, depending upon their readiness to be bound by strict moral codes, varnas will be given. Again, here also the parameter that is used for fixing the varna of a man is his moral fiber, his sense of responsibility, degree of selflessness he can show in all his dealings, the degree of oneness, the degree of collective spirit. It is this that should act as the safeguard. It is this that should act as the guard for any society. So, Yudhishthira comes out with the conclusion that Brahmana must be given death sentence and the Shudra must be given 1 year imprisonment. Bhishma was very much pleased at that. Krishna also makes a reference to it in Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, see Arjuna, there is nothing in all the three worlds that I am yet to get. I am in possession of anything and everything normally a human being aspires for. I can get anything at will, but still I am doing so much work. You know why? Whatever the man that holds the highest position in society does, the others will follow. The man in the highest position of society, a guru, a brahmana, a guru, a king, whatever a king does, the subjects will follow. Whatever the guru does, the students will follow. Whatever the father does, all family members will follow. Therefore, people in responsible positions will have to be extremely careful. This is how the concept of leadership is defined in modern day leadership textbooks and all the leadership topics and all that. If leader puts 100 steps forward in the right direction, the followers will put only 1 step. For every 100 step forward of a leader in the right direction, the followers can put only 1 step. If a leader puts 1 step backward in the line of righteousness, the followers will put 100 steps backward. That means to say, for every one mistake of the leader, the followers will do 100 mistakes. For 100 good things a leader does, the followers will do one good thing. So a leader, man in responsible position, will have to be extremely careful, and therefore in ancient India, the sort of the jurisprudence that was being exercised whenever they wanted to decide either rewards or punishments for the people for their good or bad works, what was taken very seriously, what was counted was the social position that they held, what social standing they had, what social position they had. That is how it goes. We see so many objectionable things in Manusmriti. I come across lots of complaints about Manusmriti in Karnataka in TV discussions, newspaper ratings, and all that. People that do not know anything about Manusmriti alone can make comments of that type. Manu has been a master code giver in human history. Manu has given lots of code, but he was so careful, he was so prudent, he was so vigilant to add a very beautiful caution in the midst of the code that he has given. He says, Anye krutayuge dharmaha, Tretayam dwapare apare, Anye kaliyuge nrunam, yugahrasa anurupataha. The set of code that I have given, the moral codes that I have given, all the codes, all the laws are not applicable for all the 4 yugas. There are certain principles, certain injunctions that I have given that are applicable only for Kali Yuga. Certain codes I have given are applicable only for Treta Yuga. Certain things I have given are applicable only for Dwapara Yuga, and certain other things that I have said about are applicable only for Kali Yuga. Depending upon the needs, the social need of the day, the law should always be flexible to be amended. That's what he has said. Depending upon the need of the day. Today, the people that comment about Manusmriti, they take a law applicable for Kali Yuga and they go on making comments. Nastri Swatantra Marhasi is one thing that is commented upon like anything. But Manu did not say it to be applicable for Kali Yuga. He might have said it only for a particular period. Remember, now COVID-19 has come. Certain laws, temporary laws, will have to be very strictly followed. These laws need not be followed all through your life. We must have that sense of responsibility and that ability to come to the right judgment, that sense of flexibility to fix the time duration for which the law should be made applicable, that one law that is applicable for one crisis period need not be an eternal law. There are certain COVID laws that are applicable only for the crisis period. They need not become eternal. They need not become even applicable for a year's duration or 2 years duration. This is how the lawgivers in ancient India have been extremely careful, vigilant in giving their moral codes. What I mean to say is that they have done their best. From Manu, we see Parashara coming and taking over. From Parashara, we see Yajnavalkya coming and taking over. If one code of law were to be applicable, there would be no need for series of lawgivers to come and exercise their wisdom in this regard. That itself will clearly say that Smriti is not eternal, it is changeable from time to time. That is how ancient India has done its duty in a remarkable way. We can base our present day needs upon the wisdom that those people have shown, and we can come out with a greater, a better law system whereby all the needs and necessities of the present day human generation as applicable to India will be very clearly and very satisfactorily be met. I thank the authorities, especially there is one VK Shashikumar, a law student in KLE Law College, a regular visitor to Ashrama, a close devotee of Ashrama since his primary school days. It is he that is instrumental for me to have taken part in this very meaningful and beautiful program. I really appreciate his ability to take initiatives. In fact, this is the best way left for us to make use of our free time. We can't stir out of our houses. We can't hold group discussions. We can't forum gatherings. We can't conduct any functions, etc., etc. At least there is a way whereby we can enlighten ourselves upon the topics of contemporary interest in the way that KLE College has taken the initiative of. I wish the organizers a grand success in all their future ventures, and I also welcome our great guest from Delhi. I forgot his name. He has to please excuse me. He is a very venerable man, a man of highest reputation, known for his caliber and all that. It is again reflective of the prudence of KLE authorities that they could request such a great man from Delhi to take part in today's program in order to make it more meaningful and more relevant. I thank the organizers again for the opportunity given. Thank you. Wish you all the best.
Thank you, Swamiji, for such an enlightened talk. For the vote of thanks, I would like to call upon Jagannath.
Namaste Swamiji, Honorable Chief Guest, Guest Speaker, and my dear friends. I thank the Ex Gratia team for giving me this opportunity to express my gratitude on this special day. When we told to the Swamiji about the idea of conducting the webinar, the Swamiji has supported us and inspired us. When we invited the Swamiji for inauguration of our first webinar, the Swamiji very happily accepted our invitation. On behalf of Ex Gratia team, I express my heartfelt thanks to Swamiji. I thank all the participants here on the occasion of inauguration of the first webinar. Thank you one and all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jagannath. Now to the second part of the session, I would like to introduce Dr. M.R. Venkatesh sir. Dr. M.R. Venkatesh sir is an advocate practicing in New Delhi and a partner of Agastya Legal, a practicing chartered accountant since 1993 and All India rank holder. Sri Venkatesh sir is an expert who addresses the business concerns relating to economic policies, international trade, business strategies. He is also a commentator on international trade and economic affairs. He has been campaigning on the issues of black money, participatory notes, and tax havens for over several years. Sir has authored books like Sensex, Sense and Sentiments, and Dr. Manmohan Singh, A Decade of Decay. His other works include a handbook on anti dumping, capital account convertibility, global imbalances, and the impending dollar crisis, and also a detailed report on a farm sector in India. In addition to this, Sir is also a visiting faculty in various professional institutions. Chamber of Commerce and Universities. Sir, it is an honor and a privilege to have you here. The mic is now to you, sir.
Pujaniya Swamiji, on this wonderful occasion of Guru Purnima, my humble pranams to you, to the teachers of your college, and to all those who are participating in the webinar. A warm good evening, best wishes to you. This subject of the preamble to the Constitution, probably I never anticipated that I would have to speak after Swamiji speaks. And as a matter of fact, Swamiji really stumped me by his rather philosophical yet profound observations on how ancient India organized itself. For some strange reason, a society, a civilization, a race that was built on the word duty, somehow forgot the word duty while actually writing the Constitution in 1947. Of course, during emergency, Article 51A was introduced as a fundamental duty. But we'll come to that later because today we are only talking about the preamble of the Constitution. To understand the subject and what I intend to say, probably we may have to travel and do a time travel, say 4 or 5 centuries back, and to look back at, say, traditional societies. When I say traditional societies, say probably in the 15th century or the 16th century in Europe, there was basically some sort of very defined society where men had certain definitive roles, ladies had certain definitive roles, and in most of these societies, women were seen as evil. Women were hounded as witches and women were burnt at the stakes. And this is how medieval history of Europe has been. So there has been several conflicts. The European landscape has been dotted with several conflicts on a variety of reasons. And in those times, it was not something that what we understand markets today prevailed. Markets was a very simple thing. Probably it was a village market, a shanty out there. People used to go and exchange goods. People used to exchange their products, and mostly it was vegetable or agricultural products. And that is how it all flourished and functioned. Then somewhere down the line, a variety of issues take over, and this has been best captured by Yuval Noah Harari in his celebrated book *Sapiens*. He says somewhere traditional families, their role, their responsibilities, all got challenged, and state became omnipotent, omnipresent, and that is where we created a government. And when I say we, I don't say we Indians, I say mostly Europeans. They started toying with the idea of governance, government, what type of government, how do we create government, and what will be the function of that government, so on and so forth. This formation of government was some sort of a trade-off, and some sort of a trade-off between the individual and the nebulous idea of government that was being presented. Harari says that there was a license, sort of license from the state to the individual, because till such time when the state had come into being, it was basically the traditional idea of family, the societal norms, the way families used to organize themselves, the villages used to organize themselves, the communities used to organize themselves, that prevailed. So they had to necessarily cannot have a dual organizational structure, dual structure of a command. So Yuval Harari says the state virtually gave a very, very alluring offer. Marry whomsoever you desire without asking the permission of your parents. Take up whatever job suits you, even if your community elders frown. Live however you wish, even if you cannot make it every week to the family dinner. You are no longer dependent on your family or your community. We, the state and the market, will take care of you instead. We will provide you food, shelter, education, health, welfare, and employment. In short, what it did was to atomize an individual and divorced him from his family, cut him from his family, cut him from his village, cut him from his community, cut him from his culture, cut him from his civilization. You owe an allegiance only to the state. You did not owe, and there is no law that asks you to owe allegiance to the father, mother, brother, sister. And Swamiji said duties, and that is why there is nothing called duty. There is nothing called responsibility. You can do whatever you want, provided you adhere to the four corners of the law of the land. That's all you have to adhere to, because you owe a sense of responsibility, a sense of adherence to these laws only to the state, not to anybody else. Over a period of time, what happened was that the governments also could not take this responsibility, and slowly governments became corporatized. And that is a story for another day. We will look into it. We are not going into it, but we will come to this contract between the individual. The individual got atomized and he had a pact with the government. Now, if you go to the preamble of the Constitution, it begins with "We the people of India." What is this "We the people of India"? We never, those three words have got profound meaning. And these, we the people of India, when we are entering into a contract with the government, it is called the social contract theory. The social contract theory is a contract entered into between individuals and a state and between themselves to constitute the state. So it works in two limbs. There is a pact of people coming together, that's called the pact of unionists, and a pact by which we surrender ourselves to a superior authority, it's called the pact of subjectionis. So both of these work together. So we collectively form a superior body, so that that superior body creates all laws in a manner that we all mutually agree, and we subject ourselves to that law. So this is how the whole contract theory or the social contract theory evolved, and in which it is not the family or your community or your religion or anything else matters. It all starts and ends with you as an individual having a contract with the state. So if you are an individual and you are atomized and you have a right to enter into a contract, you enter into a contract. Like what do you after 18 enter into a contract with any other person subject to section 10 of the Contract Act. So that is how contract theory was established. Now, this preamble of the Indian Constitution, which was finalized in and around November 1949, probably a day or two before it was finally dusted and sealed, is around 77 words. A few words were added in the winter of 1976, which includes the very controversial two words, socialism and secularism. I would not go into the secular part of the entire debate. I would leave it for any other day. Today we will focus on how this preamble has been constructed, what is its genetic quality, and what it intends. And that is going to be the subject of my presentation. And how the social contract theory has developed, and how it has fashioned several judgments of even the Honorable Supreme Court.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but due to some technical errors, could you continue the same in the second session?
Yeah, we would do that. How long you will give me to start the second session?
Just 5 seconds, 5 minutes more, sir.
Okay, 5 minutes, I'll start the second.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Thank you, sir. A gentle reminder to the viewers, part 1 was
Sir,
available
2 minutes only,
in
2
the
minutes.
Okay, I'll be there in 2 minutes.
To continue watching the second session, please log in through the second link given in your WhatsApp group. Thank you for your cooperation. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah. Can I continue now?
Yes, sir. Please do.
Okay. So what we saw was a constitution which had brought in two controversial words in its preamble through the 42nd Amendment in the winter of 76. Socialism and secularism. I'm not going to the secularism aspect because that's I know it's very controversial. I don't want to get into it at this point in time, but I will do it any other day. But today we will look into socialism because we don't understand. Because socialism is not defined in the Constitution, it is not defined in the General Clauses Act. As a lawyer, I would find it difficult to explain to a court what is generally meant by socialism and whether we are adhering to the tenets of socialism as prescribed in the preamble of the Constitution, that the preamble is not justiciable, that the preamble is basically a philosophical idea. All these are often taught in classes. I'm not getting into it. I would like to get into something far more substantive. Now, this debate whether India has to follow a socialist pattern was an argument that was bugging our founding fathers during the constitution debate. On 15th November 1948, even when the constitution was being framed, we had Dr. Ambedkar talking about this, and he explained it brilliantly. He says, I quote, "What should be the policy of the state? How the society should be organized in its social and economic side are matters which must be decided by the people themselves according to time and circumstances. It cannot be laid down in the constitution itself because that is destroying democracy altogether. If you state in the constitution that the social organization of the state shall take a particular form, you are, in my judgment, taking away the liberty of the people to decide. And what would be the social organization in which they wish to live? It is perfectly possible today for the majority of the people to hold that the socialist organization of society is better than the capitalist organization of society. But would it be perfectly possible for thinking people to devise some other form of social organization which might be better than the socialist organization of today or of tomorrow? See how prophetic these words are. So what was viewed in technical parlance, what Swamiji said is that the constitution can at best be a contextual reference of a particular point in time. It cannot be cast in stone, and you cannot say that this is a constitution for eternity and this is a constitution that I have presented for all times to come. But unfortunately, subsequent developments somewhere down the line has led us to believe that there is a part of the constitution which is called as the basic structure doctrine, which cannot be altered, which cannot be disturbed, which cannot be played with, which cannot be tinkered, and it is so sacrosanct that is Bible, Quran, Veda all put together. I think we need to revisit this root assumption as to whether the basic structure doctrine, in light of what I quoted about Dr. Ambedkar talking about socialism, whether the founding fathers themselves thought whether the basic structure should be such a basic structure that cannot be disturbed. For instance, it is my personal view, given the experiences of our fractured polity, that India may be best served by a presidential form of a government, whereas a person with 51% voting majority comes to become the president of India. Now, if you ask any legal scholar, he would recoil at horror that what I'm talking about is disturbing the basic structure of the constitution. Now, perhaps we have not disturbed democracy, but we are only disturbing the form of expression in a democracy or form of expression of the manifestation of the democracy, which is not a parliamentary system, but basically a presidential form of system. But today, even for a debate, unfortunately, these type of topics are not taken. But let me come back to what happened to socialism after that. Then, after which, on 13th December, Nehru was replying to this debate started by Dr. Ambedkar, and Pandit Nehru said, well, I stand for socialism, and I hope India will stand for socialism, and that India will go towards the constitution of a socialist state. And I do believe that the whole world will have to go that way. What form of socialism, again, is another matter for your consideration. But the main thing is that in such a resolution, if in accordance with my own desire, I had put in what we want a socialist state, we would have put in something which may be agreeable to many and may not be agreeable to some. And we wanted this resolution not to be controversial in regard to such matters. So consequently, despite making his point very clear, Nehru was probably not sure whether his resolution will get passed. And so the idea that India should be a socialist state was positively dropped somewhere when the constitution was being framed in the 40s. But Mrs. Indira Gandhi smuggled socialism in 1976, and India becomes a socialist state in 1977 onwards. And since then, people who opposed Indira Gandhi have come to power. People who don't agree with her policies, people who don't see eye to eye with her on her own way of economics have come to power. But for some strange reason, people have never thought it that they can amend the preamble of the constitution to tinker with the word socialism. Now, if socialism was brought in as an amendment, socialism can go out with an amendment. Now, it is not my view whether socialism is good or bad. I'm sorry. It is not my view. It is not the debate today that we are debating whether socialism is ideal. Socialism is something that we need to expand, or socialism is something that we are opposing. It is not my case. I'm not holding a brief for or against socialism. But what I'm holding a brief is definitely the fact that preamble of the constitution can be amended. If that be so, let us go back and see that why it can be amended. It can be amended for a simple reason, that it is after all a contract. It is after all a contract arising from a social contract theory. Just like Section 10 of the Contract Act says that you can enter into a contract after you are free of coercion, undue influence, fraud, mistake, so on and so forth. My humble submission to this audience would be that let us also assume that this constitution that we have given on to ourselves can be amended, whether there is a basic structure or no basic structure. Why this basic structure concept came? Now, Swamiji was right when he says that certain things that we decided or decide when there is a disaster or when there is a pressure should not be the law for all times to come. Now, he gave the example of COVID. The COVID laws probably will not last, God willing, the next 3 months. 3 months down the line, if things go well and we are out of COVID situation, I am sure the Disaster Management Act will be put on hold, and there won't be any reference to the Disaster Management Act. So consequently, whether we can still hold on to the same ideas that came about as a backdrop to the discussion on the basic rights, basic structure of the constitution, is something that we will look into shortly. What happened was, after 1975, when all of us, and I'm sure many of the law students here would have gone through ADM Jabalpur case, Keshavananda Bharati case, all this a catena of judgments, which brought through a situation where the state was held to be omnipotent. And there are two judgments which I will read out to you of both Bombay High Court and one of the Supreme Court. These are not judgments, these are observations of the court. These are not the final findings. In the case of Bombay High Court in Bhanudas Krishna Gavade matter, the court observes, and I quote, "In fact, the council went so far as to suggest that if the conditions of the detention order contained a clause that detainee are not to be allowed to eat any food, it could not be challenged, and the petitioner would have no remedy by way of a petition under Article 226, as long as the presidential order suspending the enforcement of fundamental right under Article 21, of which the right to eat is a part, is in force." In fact, that was a suggestion by the government council. He says if the detention of people under the emergency, if the presidential order suggests that the prison should not feed the prisoner, then the prisoner has no right to food. This was the thought during 1975. But today, if you hold on and say that this is an extreme position, and the remedy arising out of it was the basic structure, because subsequently also what happened in the ADM Jabalpur case, Nirande, the Attorney General, who in all due respect shamefully argued before the Supreme Court, and he said, and again the Justice Khanna writes in his book, Mr. Nirande, Attorney General, who argued on behalf of the state, contended, as he has done before the High Courts, that right now to move the court for enforcement of Article 21 has been suspended. The writ petitions were not maintainable. I sought some clarification about certain aspects, to which Nirande gave replies. It was, however, found by me that some of my colleagues who used in the past to be very vocal about human rights and civil liberties were sitting tongue-tied. Now, that was because there was emergency. And we took the pendulum from one extreme, and with the greatest of respects, Sri Palkiwala brought about this idea that there is a basic structure, and this basic structure cannot be tinkered. This basic structure is sacrosanct. This basic structure remains in for all time to come. Now you go back, read it along with the preamble. Is secularism going to be one of those ideas that we are going to hold on? Is socialism is something that we are going to hold on? Is secularism, the way it is practiced in India, the right way? I am not passing judgment on any of them. Please understand, I am nobody to pass a judgment on any of them. I am only questioning, is it the way that it is practiced, the correct way for all times to come? And let us look at the other one, which is there in the in the preamble of the Constitution, that another limb which I thought I will flag it off. Liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and of opportunity. Now, liberty per se is antithetical to equality. Liberty and equality cannot exist or coexist simultaneously. In fact, world over, people are trying to reconcile the two. In fact, many people use this argument, let there be peace and prosperity. If there is prosperity, there will always be an attack on those who are prosperous. And there will not be peace unless the prosperous know how to defend themselves. And when they defend themselves, when a society or a country spends on itself, on army, on its military, on its armaments, on its tanks, on its air force, it will suddenly think that it is far better to have a war, because the arms industry will start feeding it into a war. And that is how this whole balance gets derailed. So liberty and equality. And liberty and equality has been an idea that has flowed from the French Revolution times. And these are suddenly taken out. So we plugged something out from the American Constitution, something from the French Constitution, something from the thoughts from various other constitutions, and created a preamble which has never talked about a fundamental issue that is germane to this society, which is duty. So a preamble which talks about rights, a preamble which talks about only enforcing those rights, so has necessarily surrendered its entire population to the omnipotent state. And when the state commits some excesses, as it is prone to, and rightly it committed in 1976, because when you create a monstrous state, the omnipotent state, it will only be acting like an asura. You have created an asura, it will act like an asura. It will not act like your pet dog. It will definitely pounce on you one day or the other. And at that point in time, you then create a basic structure doctrine to insulate yourself from the omnipotent state. And that is how this whole idea has evolved. Now, what we should do? Probably we need to look at 3-4 things with which I will close for the evening. First thing that we need to close, first thing that we need to look into is that the constitution as a construct has been borrowed heavily from various other constitutions and various other documents. Probably it is a huge part of it has been produced by taking it out from the 1935 Government of India Act. I'll give you another example on which probably we need to understand this. Only to fortify my arguments. In 1947 November, after the India's independence, the Constitution Committee was parliamentary. Committee was going on into looking into the Constitution. A subcommittee was formed under Nandini Sarkar to look into the taxation issues. Now, students of indirect taxes will know the idea of GST sprouted somewhere in the year 1986 with the VP Singh's budget. And in 2016, we had this GST. It took 30 years to debate, 30 years to finally come out with a law that gives a taxation idea to the entire country, indirect taxes. But when it came to deciding the tax structure for the country, Nandini Sarkar's committee met for 3 weeks, somewhere between middle of November, and gave its report by 5th of December. And all it did was probably take everything from the British 1935 Government of India Act and decided that there will be a state government, there will be a central government, and in between there will be a finance commission to midwife the sharing process of taxes between the state and the center. And Schedule 7, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3 was taken in from there. And they said, look, we will take these taxes and we will distribute it as decided by the Finance Commission. Now, such a serious issue as to whether the government of India should tax its own subjects, what should be the manner of taxation, whether the state should tax, center should tax, and how it should tax, how much to tax. Nothing was discussed. So all was basically done by extending the idea that the British thought we should tax Indians, and so the new government thought we must also tax the independent Indians. So there was nothing new, nothing robust, nothing special about it, except that the 1935 Act was brought in as the Constitution of India. So long and short of it is, we need to revisit some of the root assumptions, beginning with whether we are a socialist state. We need to be a socialist state. And what is this extent of socialism? Whether socialism means, as again the Constitution Assembly debates, one of the members says that that I will give free something this, I will give free something that. So the one of the member gets wild. He says, why not a motorcycle and a camel to all citizens of India? This is on record in the parliamentary debates. So what we need to understand is, by socialism, we have understood that we are no longer a welfare state. We from welfare, we degenerated into populist, and populism, we degenerated into recklessness. Today, many of the schemes, many of the economic so-called welfare schemes, like in my state of Tamil Nadu, we had a scheme wherein one chief minister promised color TV sets. The next chief minister, when she came to contest, she said that I will give free mixie and grinder. So next year there is going to be an election in my state. Probably we will know after TV, grinder, whether there will be refrigerator or whether there will be something else. So we are making a mockery out of the word socialism. We are making a mockery of the powers of the state. We have not understood the basic structure doctrine. The basic structure doctrine is not in the way it has been expounded or we have understood, and that was understood in the light of emergency. That was a contextual, that was at best a smriti, as Maharaj said. We would have to relook at it and say whether the basic structure should be based on our ethos of duty, of responsibility, of carrying on ourselves with our own, standing on our own selves. Whether the government of India will actually be a facilitator, whether government of India will act as basically a provider, an enabler, rather than one on which we can say, this is my fundamental rights. And once these fundamental rights have come, there are innumerable, at least 18 to 20 rights, which today we can count as some sort of a basic right to privacy, right to food, right to education. And it would mean that all that you have to do is to be born in India. Virtually, the state will take care of several things, as the state cannot take care of several things. This COVID has proved to us the limitations of the state. The COVID has proved to us that there is enormous amount of restrictions of the state. The state can pose itself to be a phantom. The state can say that it has got the might of Hercules and Atlas. But unfortunately, the state has its own limitations. The states cannot borrow. The states cannot spend. The states don't have the ability to spend. The states' instrumentalities to monitor those spendings are limited. So we have to relook at the basic structure, not in the way we have looked, whether we can shift from rights and expressions of claiming certain expressions which are, when I use the word expression, I mean the words. When we use it without understanding, when we use it without even focusing on what it actually intends to convey, we need to go to the root of those assumptions. We need to talk to ourselves and find out whether we have given ourselves a constitution that is functional in light of several developments and in experiences. To say that constitution is sacrosanct and that will hold on for eternity is basically shirking away from our responsibility. We need to constantly remind ourselves, we need to constantly have a review of the constitution. We need to say whether the constitution functions. In this, we can strengthen certain things. We can strengthen certain people, the way we have looked at several issues. We can dilute certain powers of the government. We can dilute and say very clearly that the state will not look into certain things. For instance, to me, that the state should step in and look into the education of the people. When it is the fundamental right of people to have children, to marry, it is also their fundamental duty to educate their child up to, say, class 10. And it cannot be, the state cannot jump into your house and say, I will take your kid to the school, and then say you don't have to do anything, and I will take care of your child's education. I think we need to revisit it. I'm not questioning it, I'm only putting it across to you, whether these are certain things that needs to be relooked. The root assumptions of our constitutions need to be relooked, and that is where I thought I will make this evening's presentation. And I thought we should also understand that by and large, the second thing that we have, I would like to flag upon, is that this constitution construct is basically an understanding that an external agency is required to arbitrate between me and my fellow citizens. We always look at the state as a arbitrator. We look at the state as some sort of a justice provider. Probably this is a Hobbesian view, born out of Thomas Hobbes, who wrote his book Leviathan in 1651. And he comes out with a view that the world is bad, people are bad, and people don't have any great qualities, and people generally do not have any self-discipline. And if you look at Swamiji's initial lecture, and he pointed out repeatedly the word discipline. Discipline is where our civilization has been factoring ourselves. It plays great emphasis on discipline. It puts enormous amount of emphasis on discipline. But Thomas Hobbes said all men are bad, all men don't adhere to any norms. So there has to be an external agency, and those were the ideas that formed the idea of an omnipotent state. So if you have to go back to 16th and 17th century, these were the ideas that actually propelled these people to have, to ensure nation states came out with this type of very, very powerful governments, powerful central governments. So we, in a way, have borrowed these Hobbesian idea from Thomas Hobbes. And if you still peel the onion further, you will find that Hobbes' idea of a bad man or a bad soul in every individual is rooted to Christian idea, which believes that every individual is a sinner and every individual requires a correcting process. And the correcting process can come only from an external agency and cannot come from an internal agency. Whereas most of us believe that at least the traditional idea of India is that we need to correct ourselves. There is no external agency required to correct me. We need to correct ourselves. We need to discipline ourselves. We need to function with our own duties. We need to ensure that we adhere to certain norms. Whereas in Christianity, that is how in fact, there is a book I will strongly recommend, Born Bad by Charles Boyce, where he argues that the whole idea of Christianity is based on certain principles. Now, I'm not again going into the debate whether that is right, wrong, or whether it is something that we need to question. What I'm saying is we have based ourselves on certain principles, on certain ideas that is external or not internalized by the large section of the people. We have based our ideas on certain things which is exogenous to India. That is why in 1948, and I will stop with this. This is the third point I will like to make, and I will stop with this. That when the United Nations Human Rights Committee was being formed, the then president asked Mahatma Gandhi to send a note or a letter or some sort of communication wishing this formation. Gandhiji refused. Gandhiji said, and he quotes in the Swaraj in that letter and says that, look, from 1908 till 1948, more or less 40 years, he says, I would rather draw upon the wisdom of my illiterate but wise mother. And he says that my wife, a wise mother, never ever believed in rights. She always believed in duties. And this is the duty that will put people in good stead, not rights. So the whole idea that we, the people of India, giving ourselves a constitution which is sovereign and democratic, so that we can do unto ourselves certain things like justice, social, economic, political, liberty of thought, expression, whatnot, that comes forth. The 70 odd, 80 odd words, in my view, is antithetical. The very idea that we have given, the pacts that we have signed, the pacts of unionists and subjectivists, all are antithetical to the idea that has sustained India for several thousand years. If only we go back and probably introduce the idea of duty. And as Swamiji again said, he quoted the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas, so many things. And he says one thing that is missing in all this catina of Hindu literature that he quoted is the word duty. Rights. He said there is no rights in this. Sorry for the slip. He said there is no rights expressed in this great literature, and there is only duty. Duty is where you will find in all this literature, in this great books that you encounter. In fact, the word dharma cannot be translated to English. And you ask anyone, you go to any rural place, an illiterate person may know much more about dharma than many of us who would know about the constitution law. The point I'm emphasizing here is dharma is germane to the civilizational process of India. It stands on a much superior footing. It is time we leverage this. It's time we take this. We absorb this. And probably we go about making a huge study of the constitution. And I'm sure many youngsters here, that's the purpose of this. This is not to debunk the constitution. This is not to say we have a poor constitution. This is not to say that we should, this is not to junk the constitution. That is never my argument. this is my plea that we need to constantly relook at the constitution, review the constitution, and probably have an evaluation of the constitution, whether it is germane to the genius of this country, whether it is taking the brilliance of this country, and across community, across all religions, there will be one thing that people of this country understand is dharma. If dharma and duty are factored into our constitution, I presume that we will have a much wonderful future for the people of this country. With this, I will stop, and if there are any questions, I'm open to them. Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
There are a few questions by the audience.
Yeah.
One of them being, why was the Articles of Confederation a failure?
Why are? I didn't get that.
Why was the Article of Confederation a failure?
Article of Confederation. What is
It
that?
was one of the questions.
I'm sorry, I'm not in the know of what is the Article of Confederation. Huh?
Oh, no problem, sir. There are other questions too, sir.
Is it something to do with United Nations or United States?
Even I think so, sir. Even it's independent.
If somebody can, because I'm not able to immediately recollect. My apologies to the person who has asked this question. Probably it was, see, there were several debates in the Constitutional Assembly, including the name of India, including whether it should be United Soviet, United Socialist Democratic India or something. There are several of those debates, but I'm not able to place something on this particular thing. If my email address is given to him and he can send it to me, I will try to answer this question.
Surely, sir.
Sir, I have one
There's
question, sir. Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I have one question.
Jagannath. Hello.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, tell me.
Sir, do you not
Jagannath.
think that Article 25 and 26 are placed which are right?
See, I
Hold the
don't
dharma.
see. Today I'm not looking at Article 25, 26, 32. I'm not looking at any specific article. I am looking at rights as a concept. Rights as something that is antithetical to the civilizational force of India, which is predominantly duty-based. That is the point I am trying to face. You can, sir, we have always argued about rights. We have all 25, 26, 21, 20. Daily we argue in courts. That is not something that I want to dwell on. 25 and 26, we can always argue whether it can be better, diluted. That is a question of wordplay. But we are looking at something more substantive and something more philosophical.
Jagannath. Hello.
Sir,
Yes, I'm listening.
Jagannath. Hello.
excuse me, sir.
Hello.
There's another question.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Here, one of the audience asked a question. What is basic structure theory include?
No, basic structure includes basically part 3 of the Constitution, and that is held to be something sacrosanct and something that cannot be disturbed. If you want, you have to read the at least 6 to 8 judgments to understand the basic structure doctrine, which includes ADM Jabalpur. Then we have to read Minerva Mills. Then you have to say read Keshavananda Bharati, KPS Gill, Maneka Gandhi. So at least you have to do research of around 3,000 pages of dense judgments, judgments written in dense language and superb English of Justice Iyer. So unless you read that, it is very difficult to comprehend what is precisely meant by basic structure. But basic structure means you cannot alter certain things in the constitution. Fundamental rights cannot be touched even during emergency period. That was held during the emergency period. But what precisely constitutes basic structure and how should we go forward, whether socialism is a basic structure, whether secularism is a basic structure, secularism as is practiced, whether it's a basic structure, whether all sections of the population, including our minorities, are happy with the word secularism, whether they would love to be secular in the way secularism is being practiced in India. All these are things that we need to actually look into, which we have not looked into. Perhaps it is duty incumbent on this generation to look into it and give an answer.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an informative session. It was really very inspiring.
Thank you, ma'am. It's a pleasure listening to Swamiji, and I benefited a lot from listening to him.
Thank you for coming here, sir.
Thank you.
Now we are at the end of the session. I would like to thank our speakers of the day for such a powerful talk that we have had. I would like to thank Bhaskar sir and Rakesh sir as well, Principal sir of S.A. Manvi Law College, Gadag, and to the teaching faculty as well. A special thank you to Shashi Kumar as this is his brainchild. A big thank you to all the participants watching right now for your cooperation in making this webinar a success. Thank you one and all for your patient hearing.
Thank you.